What if I told you that a single invention, perfected just 2 years after the Titanic sank, could have prevented the greatest maritime disaster in history? What if the technology sitting in your smartphone right now could have saved 1,517 souls on that fateful April night in 1912? Tonight, I'll take you on a journey through time and technology to reveal how the unsinkable ship could have lived up to her name. But our story doesn't begin with the Titanic herself. It begins with a brilliant inventor named Reginald Fessenden working frantically in his laboratory just months after the disaster, driven by one obsession: conquering what he called those soundless perils of rock and shoal of iceberg and fog-dumb agencies of nature to menace and destroy. Let me paint you a picture of that night. April 14th, 1912, approaching midnight. The conditions were unlike anything mariners had seen in 40 years. There was no moon, no wind, no waves. The ocean was what sailors called like a mill pond, absolutely flat and perfectly still. Picture this scene. Captain Edward John Smith stands on the bridge of the largest moving object ever built by man. At 882 feet long, nearly 3 football fields, the Titanic was not just a ship, she was a floating city. Behind him, in the first-class smoking room, millionaires like John Jacob Astor IV were enjoying Cuban cigars and brandy. Below, in steerage, Irish and German immigrants dreamed of new lives in America. But 120 feet above the bridge in the crow's nest, 2 lookouts named Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were straining their eyes into the darkness, searching for ice. And here's the first shocking detail that history forgot. They had no binoculars. You heard that right. The men whose job it was to spot danger ahead were essentially blind. Why? Because the day before departure, Captain Smith had dismissed Second Officer David Blair in a last-minute crew change. Blair accidentally took the key to the binocular locker with him. The lookouts had asked for replacement binoculars, but in the rush to depart Southampton, their request was forgotten. Frederick Fleet would later testify that with binoculars, they would have spotted the iceberg enough to get out of the way. Think about that. The disaster that changed maritime history forever might have been prevented by a simple pair of binoculars that cost less than $5. But the missing binoculars were just the beginning of a cascade of failures. Captain Smith had also cancelled the mandatory lifeboat drill scheduled for the day before departure. His reason? He wanted to make up time. You see, Smith was obsessed with setting a new speed record across the Atlantic. The Titanic's speed that night was 22.5 knots, nearly full speed through waters known to be filled with ice. This brings us to our first revelation. What if modern radar had existed in 1912? Today, ship radar can detect objects over 100 miles away. The iceberg that sank the Titanic would have appeared on radar screens as a bright blip long before human eyes could ever see it. But in 1912, radar was still 23 years in the future. While the Titanic's survivors were still recovering from their ordeal, inventor Reginald Fessenden was working day and night on a revolutionary device. Fessenden, who had once worked for Thomas Edison, was haunted by the Titanic disaster. He knew that technology could prevent such tragedies, and he was determined to create it. Within 2 years of the Titanic's sinking, Fessenden's company had perfected a device that used underwater sound waves to detect objects, including icebergs. It was called Sonar, and it would revolutionize navigation forever. But for the Titanic, it was 2 years too late. Here's what will amaze you. If the Titanic had been equipped with sonar, the crew would have detected that iceberg from miles away. You see, 90% of an iceberg is underwater. While lookouts can only see the tip, sonar can detect the massive underwater bulk that extends for hundreds of feet beneath the surface. But sonar was just one piece of the technological puzzle. Modern ship radar operates on a simple principle. Radio waves are transmitted outward, and when they hit an object, like an iceberg, they bounce back to the ship. The time it takes for the signal to return tells you exactly how far away the object is. Today's naval radar can detect icebergs from over 100 miles away in any weather, day or night. But here's the truly remarkable part. Even if radar had failed, even if sonar had malfunctioned, Modern ships have a third line of defense that would have saved the Titanic: satellite monitoring. Today, the United States Coast Guard operates something called Operation Titanic. Yes, it's actually named after the ship it could have saved. This system uses satellites to monitor every iceberg in the North Atlantic. Ships receive real-time updates about ice conditions, complete with GPS coordinates and drift predictions. Commander Marcus Hirschberg of the International Ice Patrol told me something remarkable. Since we've taken over Ice Patrol, nobody that's heeded our warning has struck an iceberg. Not one ship in nearly 100 years. The system works perfectly. It just came 98 years too late for the Titanic. But detection technology is only half the story. Even if the Titanic had spotted the iceberg in time, would she have been able to avoid it? The answer lies in a shocking engineering failure that was literally holding the ship together. When the Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m., the impact lasted only 10 seconds. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side for about 100 meters. But here's what will shock you. The actual damage was tiny. Sonar mapping of the wreck has revealed that the iceberg opened only 6 thin tears in the hull, with a total area of just 12 square feet, smaller than the floor of your bathroom. So how did such minor damage sink the largest ship in the world? The answer lies in the Titanic's smallest components, her rivets. The Titanic was held together by 3 million wrought iron rivets, each one hand-forged and hammered into place. In 1998, metallurgist Tim Folk from the National Institute of Standards and Technology made a startling discovery. The rivets recovered from the wreck contained 3 times the acceptable amount of industrial waste called slag. Think of slag as impurities left over from the iron-making process. A little bit of slag actually strengthens iron, but too much makes it brittle. At the freezing temperatures of the North Atlantic that night, water temperature at 2 degrees C, just below freezing, the Titanic's rivets became as fragile as glass. When the ship struck the iceberg, the impact didn't tear open the hull. It popped the rivets like buttons on an overstuffed coat. Water rushed in between the separated hull plates, flooding the forward compartments. But here's the controversy. Not everyone agrees with the weak rivet theory. In 2012, researchers Park Stevenson and Dan Butler conducted their own tests using original Titanic blueprints and materials. Their reproduction of a Titanic hull seam withstood 20,000 pounds of force before failing, and even then remained watertight. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Some rivets were indeed substandard, particularly those installed by apprentice workers in the curved bow and stern sections where experienced riveters couldn't use their pneumatic machines. But the real killer wasn't just the rivets, it was the steel itself. When fragments of the Titanic's hull were recovered and analyzed, researchers made a chilling discovery. The steel used to build the ship was fundamentally flawed. The Titanic's steel was produced in open hearth furnaces in Scotland, a process that left the metal with high concentrations of phosphorus, oxygen and sulfur, elements that make steel brittle at low temperatures. At these frigid temperatures, the Titanic steel underwent what engineers call a ductile to brittle transition. Instead of bending and absorbing the impact energy, the steel shattered like glass. You can actually see this in the wreckage. Modern steel, when it fails, shows signs of deformation. It fights to stay together. The Titanic steel shows clean, sharp breaks that indicate catastrophic brittle failure. If the Titanic had been built with modern steel, the hull would have absorbed the impact energy by deforming rather than fracturing. The ship might have been damaged, but she wouldn't have sunk. And here's something that will truly amaze you. Modern ships aren't just built with better steel, they're not built with rivets at all. Today's ships are welded together using computer-controlled processes that create joints stronger than the metal itself. Every weld is X-rayed and tested. Quality control systems that didn't exist in 1912 ensure that every connection meets exact specifications. But the steel and rivets weren't the only design flaws that doomed the Titanic. There was something much more fundamental wrong with the ship's architecture, something that modern naval architects would never allow. The Titanic was designed to survive flooding in any 4 of her 16 watertight compartments. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, was so confident in this design that the press dubbed her practically unsinkable. But there was a fatal flaw that Andrews never anticipated. When the iceberg popped those rivets and water began rushing into the first 6 compartments, something catastrophic happened. As the bow began to sink lower, water spilled over the tops of the bulkheads into the next compartments, like water flowing from one ice cube tray to another. Here's the engineering failure. The watertight bulkheads didn't extend high enough. In the areas where the Titanic was damaged, the bulkheads only went up to E-deck. As the ship's bow sank deeper, water easily flowed over these barriers. But here's what will truly amaze you. This disaster was completely preventable with 1912 technology. The solution was called counter-flooding, and naval architects knew about it even then. By deliberately flooding compartments at the stern of the ship, the crew could have kept the Titanic level, preventing water from cascading over the bulkheads. Naval engineer David Rogers told me something remarkable. If they had counter-flooded, they could have kept the Titanic afloat until 11:30 the next morning. Think about that. Instead of sinking in 2 hours and 40 minutes, the ship could have stayed afloat for over 12 hours. More than enough time for rescue ships to arrive and save every single person aboard. The rescue ship Carpathia arrived at the scene just 3 hours and 30 minutes after the Titanic sank. If the ship had stayed afloat just 1 hour longer, everyone could have been saved. But counter-flooding wasn't attempted because it went against every instinct of a sailor. The idea of deliberately taking on more water to save a sinking ship seemed impossible. Modern ships go even further. Today's cruise ships have double hulls, essentially a ship within a ship. If the outer hull is punctured, the inner hull remains intact. The space between the hulls can flood without affecting the ship's buoyancy or stability. But even perfect technology couldn't have overcome the Titanic's greatest weakness: human judgment. Captain Edward John Smith was 62 years old on his final voyage before retirement. He was known as the millionaire's captain because wealthy passengers specifically requested to sail with him. His reputation was impeccable, or so everyone thought. Here's a shocking fact that history books rarely mention. The year before the Titanic disaster, Captain Smith was commanding the Titanic's sister ship Olympic when she collided with the British warship HMS Hawke. A naval investigation concluded that the accident was entirely Captain Smith's fault, yet White Star Line still chose him to captain their newest ship on her maiden voyage. On the night of the disaster, Captain Smith made a series of fateful decisions. Despite receiving 6 separate ice warnings from other ships, he maintained nearly full speed, 22.5 knots in an area known to be filled with icebergs. When asked later why he didn't slow down, Smith's surviving officers said he believed the ship was unsinkable and that speed was the best defense against ice. This brings us to another critical failure. First Officer William McMaster Murdoch, who was on duty when the iceberg was spotted, delayed 30 seconds before ordering the ship to turn. The collision occurred exactly 37 seconds after the iceberg was sighted. Murdoch gave the order to turn with just 7 seconds left to impact. Far too late for a ship the size of the Titanic to change course. Modern ships have automated collision avoidance systems that would have begun evasive maneuvers the moment the iceberg was detected by radar, without waiting for human decision-making. These systems can react in milliseconds, not seconds. Modern ship captains also undergo years of computer simulation training. They practice emergency scenarios hundreds of times before ever taking command of a real ship. Advanced radar, GPS, and satellite communication provide them with real-time weather and hazard information that would have prevented Smith's fatal miscalculations. Perhaps the most heartbreaking failure wasn't on the Titanic herself, but on a ship just 10 miles away. The SS Californian steamship's crew was so close to the disaster that her crew could actually see the Titanic's lights. Here's the untold story. At 11:30 p.m., just 10 minutes before the collision, the Californian's radio operator tried to warn the Titanic about ice in the area. But the Titanic's radio operator, Jack Phillips, was busy sending passenger telegrams to make extra money. Phillips angrily told the Californian to shut up and cut off the transmission. When the Titanic began firing distress rockets, the Californian's crew saw them clearly. They counted 8 rockets in total, but Captain Stanley Lord of the Californian assumed they were company recognition signals or celebration fireworks. He never ordered his radio operator to turn the wireless back on to check for distress calls. The Californian stayed put, while 1,517 people died just 10 miles away. The Californian's radio operator, exhausted from a long day, had turned off his set and gone to bed just 30 minutes before the Titanic struck the iceberg. If he had stayed on duty for just 30 more minutes, he would have received the Titanic's first distress call, and the Californian could have reached the scene in under an hour. Today, international maritime law requires ships to maintain continuous radio watch. Satellite emergency beacons automatically broadcast distress signals that cannot be ignored. GPS coordinates are transmitted instantly to coast guards around the world. But amid all this technological and human failure, there were stories of extraordinary heroism that history has largely forgotten. Let me tell you about Charles Joughin, the Titanic's chief baker, whose survival story reads like something from a medical textbook. As the ship began to sink, Joughin realized that people in the freezing Atlantic water would die of hypothermia within minutes. So he did something that seemed insane at the time, but was actually scientifically brilliant. He got drunk. Very drunk. But even while consuming massive quantities of alcohol, Joughin never forgot his duty. He spent the entire sinking helping women and children into lifeboats. When the ship finally went under, Joughin rode her down like an elevator, stepping off the stern rail into the water without even getting his hair wet. For the next 3 hours, he floated in water that was 2 degrees below freezing, water that killed other survivors in 15 minutes. The alcohol in his bloodstream acted like antifreeze, preventing hypothermia and keeping him conscious until rescue arrived. Dr. Jennifer McCarty, who has studied the Titanic's medical aspects, explained, "Alcohol dilates blood vessels and increases blood flow to extremities. In normal circumstances, this would actually increase heat loss and make hypothermia worse. But at the extreme temperatures that night, it probably saved his life by preventing his circulation from shutting down completely." Joughin survived and lived for another 44 years, passing away in 1956. But perhaps no story is more heartbreaking than that of the Navratil brothers, 2-year-old Edmund and 3-year-old Michel. They boarded the Titanic with their father, Michel Sr., who was fleeing France with his children after a bitter divorce. Michel Sr. had told his estranged wife that he was taking the boys to visit relatives for Easter. Instead, he bought second-class tickets on the Titanic under the assumed name Louis Hoffman and planned to start a new life in America. On the night of the sinking, Michel Sr. managed to get both boys into the very last lifeboat to leave the ship. As he placed 3-year-old Michel in the boat, he gave him a final message. "My child, when your mother comes for you, as she surely will, tell her that I loved her dearly and still do. Tell her I expected her to follow us, so that we might all live happily together in the peace and freedom of the new world." Those were the last words Michel Sr. ever spoke to his sons. He went down with the ship. For weeks, nobody knew who the 2 French-speaking boys were. The press called them the Titanic orphans. Their photographs appeared in newspapers around the world. Finally, their mother in France saw their picture in a morning paper and realized that her missing children were Titanic survivors. She sailed immediately to New York, and on May 16, 1912, more than a month after the disaster, she was reunited with her sons. It was one of the few truly happy endings to come from the tragedy. But there's another group of survivors whose story was deliberately erased from history: the 6 Chinese men who survived the sinking. 8 Chinese men boarded the Titanic as third-class passengers. 6 survived, a higher survival rate than first-class male passengers. Instead of being celebrated as heroes, they were vilified by the racist press of 1912. Newspapers falsely claimed they had disguised themselves as women to escape, or that they had hidden in lifeboats like cowards. The truth, revealed only recently by researcher Stephen Schwankert, was completely different. The Chinese survivors helped other passengers, shared their lifeboat space with women and children, and showed tremendous courage during the disaster. But racism prevented their heroism from being recorded in the official histories. Making matters worse, the Chinese Exclusion Act prevented them from staying in America. Within 24 hours of being rescued, they were deported back to China. Their survival story was literally erased from American history for over a century. So here's how all these technologies working together would have saved the Titanic. Let me walk you through that fateful night with 2024 technology. At 10 p.m., satellite ice monitoring would have detected the iceberg 150 miles ahead of the Titanic. GPS plotting would have shown both the ship's exact position and the iceberg's drift trajectory. Computer analysis would have calculated that the two objects were on a collision course. By 10:30 p.m., automatic collision avoidance systems would have begun plotting alternative courses. The ship's computer would have calculated multiple safe routes around the ice field, without any human intervention required. At 11 p.m., course correction would have begun automatically. The ship's autopilot would have made precise adjustments to avoid not just the immediate iceberg, but the entire ice field detected by satellite. By 11:40 p.m., the exact moment when the Titanic struck the iceberg in our timeline, the ship would have passed safely 2 miles from where the iceberg would have been. Passengers would never have even noticed the course change. But let's imagine a collision still occurred. Perhaps a massive iceberg field that even satellites couldn't navigate around, or a mechanical failure that prevented course changes. Here's what modern technology would do. At the moment of impact, hull sensors would detect the collision instantly. Automatic damage assessment systems would scan the entire hull using ultrasonic testing. The ship's computer would determine that the outer hull had been breached in 6 locations, but the inner hull would remain intact. Within 1 minute, watertight doors would seal automatically throughout the ship. Counter-flooding systems would engage, pumping ballast water into stern compartments to keep the ship level. The double hull design would contain all flooding to the space between hulls. Within 2 minutes, emergency beacons would activate automatically, transmitting GPS coordinates, passenger manifest, and damage assessment via satellite to Coast Guard rescue centers on both sides of the Atlantic. Public address systems would announce the emergency in a dozen languages. Passenger management systems would guide people to their assigned muster stations using electronic displays throughout the ship. There would be no panic, no confusion, just orderly movement to safety. By midnight, Coast Guard rescue helicopters would launch from bases in Newfoundland and Iceland. Nearby ships would receive automated distress calls with precise GPS coordinates and estimated arrival times. If lifeboats were needed, they would deploy automatically from both sides of the ship simultaneously. Each boat would carry GPS beacons, satellite communication, and climate control systems. Passengers would be tracked individually by RFID bracelets. The result? 0 deaths, and a rescue operation that would be studied for its efficiency rather than a disaster mourned for its failures. The Titanic disaster created virtually every maritime safety system we have today. Within 2 years of the sinking, nations had established the International Ice Patrol, which has prevented every iceberg collision since 1914. Not one ship that has heeded their warnings has struck an iceberg in nearly 100 years. The SOLAS Convention, Safety of Life at Sea, created international standards that have saved millions of lives over the past century. The technological innovations that followed were staggering. Operational sonar systems by 1918, radio navigation by 1924, practical radar by 1935, satellite communication in the 1960s, and GPS development beginning in 1973 with full operational capability by 1995. Today's largest cruise ship, Symphony of the Seas, carries 9,000 people, 4 times the Titanic's capacity, yet she's exponentially safer than the ship that was once called unsinkable. She has radar systems that can detect objects over 100 miles away, sonar that maps the underwater terrain continuously, GPS accurate to within 3 feet, satellite communication that never goes offline, double hull construction, compartmentalization systems with hundreds of watertight zones, evacuation systems that can empty the ship in 30 minutes, and lifeboats for 125% of all souls aboard. When the Costa Concordia ran aground off Italy in 2012, exactly 100 years after the Titanic, rescue operations were coordinated by satellite communication. Despite the ship's captain making numerous errors similar to those on the Titanic, the survival rate was 99.9%. Of 4,252 people aboard, only 32 died, and most of those deaths were due to the captain's criminally negligent behavior, not technological failure. The Titanic continues to fascinate us because it represents a turning point in human history. It was the last great disaster of the age of supreme confidence in technology, and the first great lesson in humility that would shape modern safety culture. Every person who flies in an airplane, drives a car, or takes a cruise today benefits from lessons learned in the icy waters of the North Atlantic on April 15, 1912. The 1,017 people who died that night didn't die in vain. Their deaths purchased safety for millions of others, but their sacrifice also reminds us that technology is only as good as the wisdom we use to deploy it. The Titanic had revolutionary technology for 1912, wireless communication that could reach across oceans, steel construction that dwarfed previous ships, safety features that seemed adequate for any conceivable emergency. The problem wasn't that the technology failed, it was that humans failed to use it wisely. They cut corners in construction, ignored warnings, made decisions based on overconfidence rather than prudence, and allowed commercial considerations to override safety concerns. Captain Smith cancelled lifeboat drills to save time. The binocular key was lost in a last-minute crew change. The Californian's radio operator went to bed 30 minutes too early. Phillips dismissed ice warnings because he was busy with passenger telegrams. Each decision seemed reasonable at the time, but together they created a cascade of failures that no ship could survive. This is the Titanic's greatest legacy, not the tragedy itself, but the transformation in thinking that the tragedy produced. We learned that there is no such thing as an unsinkable ship, but there is such a thing as a survivable disaster if we have the wisdom to prepare for it. Modern safety philosophy is built on the opposite principle from the Titanic era: assume everything will fail. Engineers design for graceful degradation. When one system fails, others take over seamlessly. No single point of failure can doom the entire vessel. This philosophy extends beyond technology to human factors. Modern ship officers undergo psychological testing and simulator training specifically designed to overcome the overconfidence that doomed the Titanic. The Titanic could have been saved by modern technology, but she was really lost to ancient human failings: overconfidence, complacency, and the belief that we are smarter than nature. The technology that could have saved her was invented within years of her sinking: sonar by 1918, radio navigation by 1924. But the wisdom that would have prevented her sinking came from her sinking itself. That iceberg, in destroying one ship, ended up saving countless others. The disaster shocked the world into action and created virtually every maritime safety system we have today. Every radar installation, every satellite beacon, every lifeboat drill, every ice warning, they all trace their origins back to that frozen April night in 1912. As we watch the sun set over the North Atlantic, in the same waters where the Titanic made her final voyage, we're reminded that ships still cross these waters every day, but now they cross them with the accumulated wisdom of a century of technological progress and the sobering memory of a single night when hubris met reality, and reality won. In the end, the Titanic's greatest rescue was not of her passengers. It was of all the passengers who came after, sailing on safer ships through safer seas, protected by the lessons learned from one terrible night when the impossible became inevitable. And that, ultimately, is the story the Titanic tells us. Not about the limits of technology, but about the necessity of wisdom. Not about what we can build, but about how we must think. Not about being unsinkable, but about being prepared for the unthinkable. The Titanic sank because brilliant engineers, experienced sailors, and confident businessmen all believed that disaster was impossible. Modern ships float because we've learned that disaster is always possible, and we've built our entire safety culture around that single hard-won truth.